Andrew always believed his marriage to Melissa was perfect. She told him she loved him, and they always spent their evenings together. But one day, everything started to change. Melissa began staying late at work without explanation, and her phone was always face down. One afternoon, coming home earlier than usual, Andrew noticed an unfamiliar car parked near their house. Later that night, when Melissa thought he was asleep, she received a message that made her face go pale, as if she had seen a ghost. Who was the stranger? And what was she hiding? Andrew knew something was wrong, but he had no idea just how deep her secret ran. He began collecting evidence, but was he ready to uncover the truth that would change his life forever? She didn't understand that her betrayal would lead to the most unforgettable lesson of her life. Andrew sat at his desk in the living room, checking several documents he needed to send by the end of the day. He often worked from home. It allowed him to be closer to Melissa. She, in turn, also worked from home, but her job was somewhat different. Marketing, beauty blogging, shoots, numerous advertising contracts. Their relationship had become somewhat cold lately. Melissa was paying more attention to her work than to him. He could feel it, but tried not to pay too much attention to it. After all, every marriage has moments when life gets in the way of being always together. But today was different. Andrew heard Melissa walking up the stairs to the living room. He didn't look up from his papers, just waiting for her familiar hello, or the faint rustle of her boots on the parquet floor. Hi. Melissa's voice didn't sound quite the same as usual. There was an inexplicable tension in it. Andrew lifted his gaze and saw her standing by the door. She looked the same as always, but today something was off. Her face looked a little more clouded than usual. Usually, she was very open and cheerful, but today there was something in her gaze that couldn't be described in words. Are you okay? Andrew asked, watching as she uncomfortably scanned the room. Melissa smiled faintly and sat on the couch, looking out the window. She seemed overwhelmed, her gaze somewhat absent. Yeah, I'm fine. Just a bit tired. She lowered her head, as if trying to gather her thoughts. Andrew couldn't help but notice how her hand trembled slightly as she placed it on the back of the couch. And what was even more curious, the scent left by her perfume was unfamiliar. Instead of her usual favorite fragrance, today it smelled of something else, more spicy and sweet. New perfume? He asked, without thinking. Melissa looked at him a little surprised, then quickly turned her gaze to her hands. Yeah, it's a new scent. I just bought it today. But something about her answer wasn't convincing. She was avoiding his gaze. Andrew fell silent for a moment. He couldn't quite grasp what he was feeling. Doubts crept into his heart, but he didn't want to believe what was really happening. Melissa got up from the couch and went to the kitchen. She tried to act busy, but her behavior only confirmed his suspicions. Something was off. And with every passing minute, as she went about her usual routine, Andrew's heart raced faster with anxiety. A few minutes later, when Melissa returned, Andrew tried to distract himself with work again. How's the blog going? I saw you got a few new orders, he said, trying to sound calm. Melissa froze for a moment, her hand tightening around the coffee cup, and for a second, her eyes lit up with a strange expression. Yeah, everything's fine. It's a busy time, she replied, but her voice sounded unusually strained. Andrew noticed that she was nervous. Something was wrong. Andrew sat on the couch, watching as Melissa immersed herself in her phone once more. She sat beside him, but there was an unusual silence between them. She no longer asked about his day or showed interest in his matters. They used to have long evenings where they discussed everything, from work to future plans. Now, she sat there, not even paying attention to him. Andrew felt his heart begin to race. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening. Melissa was becoming more distant. Her gaze, even when they sat next to each other, was empty. Even her reactions to his questions were becoming colder. Melissa, he tried one evening, when she simply turned away from him. Why aren't you answering me? What's going on? She sighed, set her phone down, and looked at him. There was none of the warmth in her eyes that they once shared. Just nothing, she replied curtly. I'm tired. Andrew couldn't accept that. He kept watching her behavior and over the next few days, noticed even more strange moments. Melissa went off to another one of her meetings with friends, although he couldn't recall the last time she had mentioned these meetings. She came home late, and even her apologies sounded like automatic words, nothing more. That evening, he decided, he had to find out what was going on. After she fell asleep, Andrew approached her computer. He wasn't sure if he was doing the right thing, but his intuition told him he needed to get to the bottom of things. He entered her password, which she never hid, and logged into the system. All her files were organized: work documents, travel photos, future plans. He didn't find anything suspicious until he came across her correspondence with a colleague, Nick. At first, he didn't think much of it, but then he went back to the messages. Melissa was writing to him about meetings, asking how he was spending his time. One of the last messages was a question. "Do you want to meet after work, just to talk?" It seemed like a regular work inquiry, but something in his heart soured. Andrew decided to wait until morning to talk to Melissa. He didn't want to make hasty conclusions, but this was too much. In the morning, when she woke up, he calmly asked her, "Melissa, I found your messages with Nick. What are these meetings after work about?" She didn't answer immediately. The pause only made him doubt even more. "Andrew, it's not what you think," she finally said, turning away. "And what do you think?" he asked, trying not to show emotion. "What do I think? I don't understand why you're trying to deceive me." She walked toward him but turned away again. Her gaze was filled with uncertainty. "You don't understand anything," she whispered. "But it's just work. Only work, Andrew." Melissa left the room, and he was left alone. He couldn't get her words out of his head. The feeling of betrayal was growing, and he could no longer calmly observe her behavior. All these inconsistencies and strange reactions no longer seemed like coincidences. The next day, Melissa came back from work. Andrew felt the pressure of uncertainty consuming him more and more. Melissa showed him some gifts she had received anonymously. He could no longer sit at home and watch Melissa drift away from him. At the moment when she said she didn't know who these gifts were from, he realized this couldn't go on any longer. It was no longer a coincidence. "Melissa," he said one evening when she once again took out new jewelry from a package, "seriously? You don't know who it's from?" She shrugged, quickly hid the gift in her bag, and turned away again. "It's nothing, just some admirer," she replied. Andrew smiled, although there was no longer the calmness in his eyes that had been there before. He felt his heart race, and doubts were growing inside him. That night, he decided to take action. When Melissa left for another meeting, Andrew couldn't stay home. He followed her, hoping that at least today he would get answers to his questions. He drove after her across the city, keeping his distance. She didn't notice him, focused on her phone, constantly replying to messages. He kept following her until she stopped at a cafe, where she met Nick. It seemed harmless. He didn't see anything that could definitively confirm his suspicions. They were just talking over coffee, laughing, and discussing work matters. But the way they looked at each other seemed to indicate there was more between them than just friendship. Andrew felt an inexplicable pain, but he didn't approach and didn't take any drastic actions. He stayed in the shadows, not wanting to be seen. He turned around and walked away, leaving them alone. When Melissa returned home, she was the same, polite but distant. There was no guilt in her eyes, even though Andrew increasingly felt that something was being hidden from him. "How was the meeting?" he asked calmly, sitting on the couch. "It was good," she replied, not looking at him. "Nick wants me to help with a new project. You know, it's important for my career." "Again him," Andrew commented. "Again what?" Melissa asked, her voice sounding a bit sharp. "You know what I mean. Again the gifts, the meetings. Can't you just admit that something's off?" Melissa fell silent for a moment, then spoke in a tone that surprised Andrew even more. "I don't know who these gifts are from. I didn't ask for them. It's just someone who wants to make me happy." Andrew gave her a look full of disappointment. He didn't believe her. He knew this story wouldn't end here. He didn't have direct evidence yet, but his intuition told him that things were much worse than he had thought. Over the next few days, his observations only deepened his doubts. Melissa became even more closed off, spending more time on her phone, at work, and even outside the house. She kept coming up with new excuses for her late outings and constantly avoided discussions about Nick. Something didn't feel right, but direct evidence of infidelity never materialized. Andrew couldn't trust his feelings without concrete facts. He was confused. However, he decided that this time, he would take the final step. He decided he would definitely find out who this admirer was, the one giving her gifts. One evening, he followed her again. And this time he decided that if she went to Nick, he would follow. And that's exactly what happened. She went to the cafe where she met him. But this time, Andrew got closer, leaving no chance for denial. When he approached their table, Nick's face changed. At that moment, Andrew understood that things were not as he had been told. Nick smiled, but there was fear in his eyes. Andrew, we're just... Nick began, but Melissa interrupted him. It's not what you think, she said, trying to hide her nerves. She stood before him, and Andrew silently looked at both of them. So who's giving these gifts? He asked, throwing a glance at Melissa. Melissa sighed and fell silent, while Nick spoke up. They're not from me, Andrew. Melissa and I. We've been working together for a few months, nothing more. Andrew stood there, listening, and realized he was wrong. It seemed there was nothing between Melissa and Nick. Sorry, I must be really tired. I'll go home, said Andrew. You really need to rest, Andrew. You're very jealous, Melissa said. Andrew drove home. He returned home late at night, feeling exhausted and confused. He tried to analyze everything that had happened that evening, but his thoughts just tangled. He didn't have any direct evidence of infidelity. Nick had clearly denied everything, and Melissa, although she seemed nervous, hadn't confirmed any suspicions. The gifts she received remained a mystery. Maybe I'm really overreacting, he thought, watching the evening news on TV. Melissa seems fine. Everything seems normal. Well, I'll think about it again and decide what to do. The next day, Andrew decided to take a short break from his surveillance. He couldn't keep focusing on his suspicions, as that would only worsen the situation. But one moment made him return to his plan. Melissa had indeed changed. She was spending more time on her phone again. Sometimes, when he tried to talk to her, she became a bit distant, silent, or gave short responses. Andrew noticed how she carefully scrolled through her messages on her phone, often smiling in response, but when he got closer, she quickly closed the screen. Are you always on your phone? Is someone bothering you? He asked, sitting on the couch next to her. No, everything's fine. She tried to appear calm. Just talking to a friend. Nothing important. But he saw that wasn't entirely true. At that moment, it dawned on him. He had to take one more chance. He couldn't just back down. This time, he decided to find out the truth, not relying solely on words. A few days later, he followed Melissa again. He saw her hurriedly leave the house and then get into her car. He set off after her, trying to stay unnoticed, but he still felt his heart racing. Melissa went to the same cafe where he had seen her with Nick before. Andrew left his car in the parking lot and approached the cafe, hiding behind a street lamp. Again, he saw Melissa sitting at a table with some man. But this time, something was off. The man looked familiar. Andrew squinted, and his heart clenched. It was her ex-boyfriend Daniel. What's he doing here? Andrew thought, trying not to panic. He watched them closely. Daniel and Melissa were laughing, exchanging some kind of slang, and there was something in their eyes that said more than just friendship. Andrew began to feel like he understood everything, but he still couldn't find direct evidence. He tried to get closer to hear what they were saying, but it was difficult. They clearly noticed his presence and became less open. Melissa seemed very cautious, but the way she looked at Daniel left no doubt. He wasn't just an ex. He was someone who still meant a lot to her. When they said goodbye, Andrew saw Daniel hug Melissa and kiss her on the cheek. Although it didn't look like anything more than friendly, Andrew couldn't help but notice how long his gaze lingered on her. He was sure something was wrong. He returned home with heavy thoughts. He had no concrete evidence of infidelity, but everything started to come together into one picture. Melissa hadn't told him that her ex had reappeared in her life. Why hadn't she shared that with him? That evening, sitting in the kitchen, he decided to talk to her. Melissa, are you really not telling me everything that's going on? I saw you with Daniel today. Do you spend a lot of time together? She froze for a moment, then looked at him as if hesitating whether to continue the conversation. It's nothing, Andrew. Just old friends. You know we just keep in touch from time to time. But why didn't you tell me about this earlier? Why are you acting like this? He asked. I didn't want you to think badly of it, Melissa replied, a little nervous. It really isn't anything serious. But her eyes couldn't hide a slight nervous gleam. He realized that, even though she was trying to deny it, something was definitely going on. He didn't know whether to continue his surveillance or find another way to act. But he was feeling more and more that the truth wouldn't be told to him directly. And at that moment, he decided that it was time to take the next step in his investigation. And have you found out who was giving you those gifts? Andrew asked. No, I still haven't found out, but what's the difference, right? Melissa said. Andrew realized that he could no longer just wait and watch. He decided that he needed to find out the truth. He started to come up with a plan to get more information, but to do so, he would have to talk to people who might know more about Melissa's relationship with her ex, Daniel. He had one friend, Lisa, who was close to Melissa and might be able to tell him more about these old connections. The next day, he met with this friend, Lisa, at a cafe. Lisa was a short woman with short dark hair, always open and cheerful. She knew that Andrew had some doubts about Melissa's relationship with Daniel, but according to her, it was a long time ago and didn't matter anymore. Lisa, I saw Melissa with Daniel. It's starting to worry me. Can you tell me more about them? Asked Andrew, sitting at the table and looking at her with an intense gaze. Lisa looked at him with some hesitation. Well, look, it's not what you think, she began, playing with her cup. Melissa and Daniel had a long history. They were together, but it ended a few years ago because of his problems. You know, Daniel wasn't always the best choice for Melissa. He promised a lot, but then never delivered. So, she decided to break up with him. Andrew felt his heart start to beat faster. He tried not to show his nervousness, but he became more alert. So, it was an old story, and they don't see each other anymore? He asked, trying to learn more. Lisa smiled sadly. You know, Daniel hasn't changed. He sometimes comes around and tries to talk to her, but Melissa has always been very cautious with him. She doesn't want to go back to that. She already figured out he's not the one for her. Andrew tried to calm down, but even more questions started to form. He couldn't forget what he had seen in the cafe, when Melissa and Daniel were laughing together, when they looked so close, so natural together. But you haven't seen them start getting closer again? He asked, unable to hide his anxiety. Lisa looked at him and, apparently, understood that he was worried. No, Andrew. Melissa. She's been through all of that a long time ago. Trust me. You know her. She doesn't like to play with feelings. If something were happening, she would have told you. I'm sure of it. Maybe he's just trying to get her attention again, and she doesn't know how to stop it. Andrew was grateful for her words, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something he didn't understand. All right, I understand, he said, even though it was hard for him to believe. But why didn't she tell me about this earlier? Why does it all seem so hidden? Lisa just shrugged. I don't know. Maybe she didn't want to worry you. You know, Melissa's always been like that. She doesn't like to bring up unnecessary issues. Andrew returned home with broken thoughts. He hadn't received clear answers to his questions, and this only intensified his doubts. He tried to put these thoughts aside for later, but they wouldn't leave him alone. That evening, when he got home, Melissa, as usual, was sitting in her favorite chair with her phone in hand. She looked normal, but to Andrew, it seemed even more suspicious. What had she been doing all this time? She kept receiving gifts, but now, when he tried to figure out who was sending them, she just assured him that she didn't know who it could be. Melissa, do you really not know who's sending you the gifts? He asked, looking at her, trying to appear calm, although anxiety was boiling inside him. She looked up and seemed startled for a moment. They're just gifts from someone. I don't know who it is. It doesn't matter, Andrew, she said with a nervous smile. This wasn't what he had expected. She looked as mysterious as always, but this mystery only fueled his suspicions. In the following days, Andrew began to feel that his life was gradually turning into a game filled with constant doubts. The gifts she was receiving remained unexplained. Lisa assured him that Melissa would not go back to Daniel, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only part of the story. He started getting anxious when he saw how Melissa interacted with Daniel, how they exchanged looks that seemed meaningful to him. Why hadn't she told him about this? And wasn't it possible that it was Daniel who had given her those gifts? Andrew sat on the couch, his gaze fixed on the monitor, but he couldn't focus on his work. Melissa was in another room, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. For several days, he felt like he was on the verge of discovering something important, but everything was tangled up. The gifts she received, her connection with Daniel, all of it began to raise doubts in him. Every day, he tried to figure out what was really going on. Why did Melissa mention Daniel so often? Why did her face change when he asked about them? He couldn't just ignore all of this. However, when he came home the next evening, he noticed something new. Melissa seemed to be in a good mood, too good to simply ignore his suspicions. She was sitting in the kitchen, drinking tea, and talking to someone on the phone. When she saw him, she immediately stopped the conversation. "Hey babe, how was your day?" Her voice sounded calm, but Andrew noticed how carefully she put the phone down on the table. "Everything's fine," he replied, trying to stay calm. "How about you? I saw you talking to Daniel." Melissa seemed taken aback at first, but quickly concealed her nervousness. "Oh, well, we sometimes text just to check on how he's doing. Just as friends," she said, trying to keep her composure. "He wants to get back together, but only as a friend. Nothing more." Andrew felt his heart race. He knew this could just be her way of deflecting his attention, but he decided to continue the conversation to learn more. "Are you sure?" he asked, sitting across from her. "You said he wasn't right for you. Why are you still talking to him?" Melissa smiled, but her eyes looked sad. "It's just memories, Andrew. We haven't been together for a long time, and now he understands that we don't belong together, but he wants to be friends. And that's it. Don't worry, it doesn't change anything between us." Andrew thought for a moment. He tried not to let his emotions take over, but her words didn't sound convincing. She could genuinely be friends with him, but he'd seen how they interacted, how her face changed every time they spoke. "Okay," he said, though not fully satisfied with her answer. "But these gifts, you still haven't explained who is sending them." Melissa slightly shook her head, trying to laugh it off to ease the tension. "Oh, I love getting gifts. It could be from one of my colleagues or friends. Just little things." Andrew tried to hide his displeasure, but the question still lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to all of this than it seemed. In the following days, he became even more worried. He noticed how Melissa was pulling away from him more and more, and when he paid attention to her mobile phone, she would try to hide the screen or quickly put it down on the table. It all seemed suspicious. Andrew decided to have another talk with Lisa. He met her as she was heading home from work. He couldn't wait any longer and wanted to find out more about Melissa and Daniel's relationship because he felt the situation was spiraling in a direction he didn't want. "Lisa, I can't figure out what's going on with Melissa. She keeps telling me there's nothing between her and Daniel, but it doesn't seem true. I've seen how she acts around him, and it doesn't look like just friendship," he said, sitting at the table and holding a cup of coffee. Lisa looked at him in surprise and sighed. "I understand your doubts, but you need to know that she really doesn't want to get back together with Daniel. That was in the past and won't happen again. She just doesn't want to create a scene over the fact that Daniel sometimes tries to reconnect with her." Andrew was troubled. Something wasn't adding up. He tried to act like her words gave him some relief, but his intuition told him Melissa was hiding something important. "Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Is she acting differently?" he asked. Lisa looked at him thoughtfully. "Maybe she's just stressed about work or other things. But I haven't noticed anything suspicious." Andrew felt like he wasn't getting the answers he needed. He decided to keep pressing forward, even though he didn't have solid proof of infidelity. Yet he was convinced that Daniel was part of the puzzle. That evening, he walked into the room where Melissa was engrossed in her phone. Her gaze was distracted, and she didn't even notice him standing nearby. "Who is it?" he asked, looking at her. She looked up and smiled. "It's just a colleague. Nothing important." That same answer again, that same feeling she was trying to hide something more. Andrew began to realize there was more to this situation than he knew. Until he uncovered the truth, it would remain a real challenge for him. In the following days, Andrew started thinking about what to do next. Andrew sat at the table, staring at photos and messages on the phone screen. It was the third time that week he'd gone through her phone. This time, he came across some interesting details that wouldn't let him rest. He felt like he'd only been seeing fragments of the picture until now, but something was finally coming together. The gifts Melissa had received recently were, to say the least, peculiar. They were expensive, elegantly wrapped, and always came with anonymous notes. At first, he tried convincing himself it was just a coincidence. Maybe someone was being generous for no reason. But when he found yet another note with the same kind of message, he couldn't just brush it off. Let these moments bring you happiness, my dear Melissa. I hope you haven't forgotten how it used to be. Those words made his heart race. He knew very well that such phrases could only have come from one man. Her ex, Daniel. Something didn't add up. If these gifts are from him, then why does she say she doesn't know who's sending them? He whispered to himself, examining the cards with no signatures or clues. Andrew didn't have any solid proof, but his intuition told him this was far from simple. He made a quick decision. He needed to talk to someone who might know more. Andrew decided to speak again with Lisa, Melissa's best friend, who had more connections and often knew more than Melissa herself. Lisa, I didn't ask you to meet me here for nothing, Andrew began as they sat at a coffee shop near his home. I need to know the truth. You know Melissa has been getting these gifts. Have you heard anything about them? Lisa looked at him with a hint of caution, but her expression softened as she saw the serious look on his face. Yes, I've heard, Lisa admitted. But Andrew, she really doesn't know who's sending them. Believe me, she told me she has no idea who it could be. Have you seen the notes yourself? Andrew nodded. I've seen them, and I know it's not just some random admirer. It's someone she knows well. These are old words, things only he would use. Lisa sighed and glanced away, visibly hesitant to say more. She knew something she didn't want to reveal, but finally decided to continue. I don't want to alarm you, she said carefully, but I heard from a few acquaintances that they saw Melissa and Daniel together at the movies a couple of weeks ago. I don't know what's going on between them, but they were definitely there together. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe not. I don't know how to explain it. Andrew was stunned. His nerves started to fray, but he worked hard to keep his composure. And what do you think about this? Why would they be together? Could it really just be friendship? Lisa hesitated, then shrugged. I can't say for sure. They've never told me anything about it, but there was definitely some chemistry between them. I don't want to say more because it might confuse you even further. I can't guarantee that it's what you think it is. Andrew stood up, nervously fidgeting with his fingers. He felt like he was on the verge of understanding what was happening, but didn't yet have all the answers. I thought you might know more, he said, looking at Lisa. But now everything is just more confusing. Lisa raised her hands, trying to calm him down. Andrew, I don't know everything, and I can't give you all the answers. You respect Melissa, but even she might not tell you the full truth because she knows you're not ready to hear it. You'll figure it out yourself. Andrew left the cafe, his thoughts racing. He felt like all of this couldn't just be a coincidence, and that the truth was waiting to be uncovered. Still, he lacked concrete evidence. What if Lisa hadn't told him everything? Or maybe Melissa simply didn't want him to know. The next day, he went to Melissa's house again to confront her. He couldn't keep all of this bottled up any longer. Melissa, I know you're not telling me everything. I've seen the gifts, and I heard you went to the movies with Daniel. I want to know what's really going on between you two. I can't keep pretending everything is fine. Melissa looked flustered, but quickly regained her composure. Andrew, I know you're worried, she said, but you've misunderstood everything. Yes, I saw Daniel, but it was a while ago. It doesn't mean anything. He just wants to be part of my life as a friend, and you need to accept that. Andrew wasn't convinced by her words. He lacked proof, but felt that he would uncover the truth on his own. Even though she hadn't told him everything, he knew that soon he'd have to take the next step. Andrew decided to meet Daniel and speak with him directly. Andrew nervously smoked near the restaurant entrance, waiting for his meeting with Daniel. Everything he had learned in the past few days wouldn't let him rest. The unsigned gifts Melissa had been receiving, her strange excuses, it all refused to form a coherent picture. But most of all, why was she so adamant about avoiding the truth? He had to talk to Daniel. Yes, Daniel. her ex-boyfriend, who somehow still lingered in their lives. Andrew wasn't sure what to expect from this meeting, but he couldn't just ignore the situation. When Daniel finally arrived, his smile was faint but confident. Andrew walked up to him, deciding not to waste time on pleasantries. "You know why I'm here," Andrew said, looking Daniel straight in the eye. "I want to know what's going on between you and Melissa. This is all too much." Daniel smirked slightly, but his gaze remained cold. "What do you want to know, Andrew?" Daniel asked, leaning in slightly. "Melissa still hasn't told you? She's always been a fantastic actress, hasn't she?" Andrew felt his chest tighten but managed to stay composed. "Are you saying you're back with her?" Andrew replied, trying not to show his nerves. "What are you doing in her life? I know something's off, and I won't let you worm your way back into her heart." Daniel finally dropped the pretense. He took a step forward, his tone now firm and self-assured. "Melissa has always been mine. I know she still loves me, even if she doesn't admit it to you. And you need to understand that, Andrew. She's open to me. I could take her from you anytime I wanted. You can't stop it." Those words hit Andrew hard, but he felt his anger rising. He couldn't let Daniel win. "Melissa would never betray me, especially not with you," Andrew said firmly, meeting Daniel's gaze. "She's with me, and you can't change that." Daniel's smirk widened, though a hint of irony flickered in his eyes. "You think she'll stay with you after everything? After you've seen how she reacts to me? She wants me. It's just a matter of time." Andrew took a deep breath, feeling his confidence waver with every word Daniel spoke, but he refused to let it break him. He decided to stay calm. "I know who she is, and I know how she thinks," Andrew said. "You don't understand her like I do. That's your problem, not mine. She won't leave me for you." Daniel stared at Andrew silently, but his gaze carried no doubt. He knew his words had struck a chord. "You can keep believing that, but reality will catch up to you," Daniel said with a parting smirk before walking away. Andrew stood there for a few moments before heading home, processing everything that had just happened. His heart raced, but he wouldn't let his fears rob him of his faith in Melissa. When he walked into the house, Melissa was home, sitting on the couch and scrolling through her phone. She smiled when she saw him. "Andrew, you're home early. How was the meeting?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Andrew didn't answer right away, studying her expression carefully. He didn't know what was true anymore, but he felt that his words earlier hadn't been wasted. "I talked to Daniel," he said as he approached her. "I know everything I need to know, and I understand he's trying to come between us." Melissa looked at him in surprise, but her face betrayed no guilt or curiosity. "Why would you even listen to him?" she asked, trying to turn the situation in her favor. "It's all lies, Andrew. I was never with him." Andrew just looked at her, realizing that with every word she spoke, his doubts grew stronger. "Melissa, I want to believe you," he said. "But why can't you just tell me the truth? I'm your husband." Melissa paused for a moment before standing up and walking over to him, taking his hands in hers. "Andrew, this is hard for me. I just don't want to hurt you. I love you, and that's all that matters." Andrew didn't reply. He couldn't understand why everything seemed this way. Was he just too trusting, or was Melissa truly the person she appeared to be? All he could do was wait to uncover the truth. Andrew sat in his car, watching Melissa as she packed her things and left the house. She said she was going out of town for a few days for work. A business trip, she had explained, but doubts swirled in his mind. Something didn't feel right, and he couldn't just let it go. He decided to follow her. Quietly, he got into his car and began trailing her. At a distance, of course. He kept his distance to avoid raising suspicion. Her car slowly pulled out of the driveway and headed down the road. Andrew instinctively quickened his pace, making sure to stay just far enough behind. Melissa didn't notice him. She had no idea she was being followed. She stopped at a small house that didn't look anything like a business trip destination. The door opened, and out came a man Andrew had seen before, Daniel. His heart sank. He couldn't deny it anymore. Something was definitely wrong. Melissa wasn't alone. They got into the car together and drove off. Andrew couldn't resist and continued following them. Everything he had observed started to make sense. He realized he had to find out the truth, no matter what she might say. He followed them until they stopped at a hotel. Both of them got out of the car and walked inside. Andrew parked a few blocks away, waiting for several minutes. He was shocked, but what surprised him even more was the thought that Melissa and Daniel might have something far deeper than shared memories. He didn't know how to react. Thoughts raced through his mind, but he eventually decided he had to act. He waited for an hour, trying to calm his pounding heart. When the time came, he quietly stepped out of his car and approached the hotel. The doors were unlocked. Without much hesitation, he entered. He heard their voices before he saw their faces. They were laughing, talking, and everything sounded normal, but Andrew's sense of unease wouldn't let him go. He approached the door to their room. It was slightly ajar, and he couldn't hold back any longer. He stepped inside. Andrew saw what he didn't want to see. Melissa and Daniel were lying on the bed, kissing and holding each other. He froze in place, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. He felt his heart shatter with pain as his thoughts scrambled for any shred of logic. But the truth was undeniable. This was betrayal. "Melissa," he said, his voice dry and ominous. Melissa and Daniel both jumped, startled by Andrew's presence. She quickly pulled away from Daniel, while he got up and walked toward Andrew. "What are you doing here?" Daniel asked, trying to maintain composure. Andrew looked at Melissa but couldn't say a word. His eyes were full of pain and disappointment. I couldn't believe my eyes," Andrew said quietly. "But here I am." Melissa stayed silent, her expression lost and confused. She knew she couldn't deny what had happened. Everything was clearer than ever before. "This isn't what it looks like," she began, but her voice was shaky. "I've seen enough to understand," Andrew interrupted. "Why did you do this? Why did you lie to me?" Daniel stepped forward, attempting to intervene. "There's no need to explain anything else, Andrew," Daniel said with a slight smirk. "You've seen everything for yourself." Melissa got up from the bed and walked toward him. Her eyes were filled with a mix of emotions, remorse and guilt. "I don't know what to say. I never wanted to hurt you. I love you. But all of this happened before I saw how much you'd changed. I thought I'd stay with you. But everything got so tangled." Andrew nodded quietly, realizing there was no point in hiding anything anymore. He looked at her, and the only thought in his mind was whether it had all been for nothing. "I loved you, Melissa, but now it's hard to believe you," he said. "I don't know if this can ever be forgiven." He turned and walked out of the room without looking back at them. His heart felt heavy, but he couldn't just leave things as they were. He wasn't sure if he could ever forgive her, but one thing was clear. He couldn't live in this lie any longer. Andrew sat in the darkness of his room, his thoughts swirling and his heart pounding in his chest. Melissa had betrayed him, and he'd seen it with his own eyes. She and Daniel, together, kissing and holding each other. It was a shock to his system. He couldn't believe this was happening to him. He had been so sure he loved her, so sure she would never do something like this. Now that the pain had dulled slightly, he had a single goal in mind. He wanted to turn the situation to his advantage. Melissa needed to understand that she had made a serious mistake, and while he wasn't someone who usually sought revenge, this time it felt necessary. He knew her life had changed and that things could never go back to the way they were, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't let her come out of this unscathed. The next day, when Melissa returned from her trip, he didn't greet her with open arms or listen to her apologies. He didn't say a word. She looked at him in confusion, not understanding what had happened. She still believed she could convince him that it wasn't as serious as it seemed, that nothing truly bad had occurred. "Andrew, why are you silent?" she asked nervously. "I know it looks bad, but we just happened to meet up. It didn't mean anything." Andrew looked at her, his voice calm but resolute. "Melissa, you betrayed me. You could have told me the truth, but you chose to lie. You should have been honest, but instead, you chose this." She sighed and sat down beside him. "I know I made a huge mistake. I understand that. I love you. You know that. You're the only one I want. I'm so sorry. I can't believe this even happened." Andrew didn't give her any chances for forgiveness. He had decided that her lesson would be harsh. He was heartbroken but calm, his gaze fixed on her. "You love me?" he asked coldly. "Then why did you do this? If this is love, I don't understand what kind of love it is. Melissa started to deny it again, trying to find words that might rebuild his trust. But Andrew had resolved not to believe her words. She didn't understand that her betrayal was a lesson for him, not for her. He responded with a clear decision. I can't just forgive you. You need to realize that all of this has changed our relationship. You no longer have what you wanted. Melissa immediately sensed that something was shifting. She looked at Andrew, her eyes filled with tears, and she began to cry. I'll do anything. I'll change. She begged. You don't understand. It was all a mistake. I never meant to hurt you. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. But Andrew remained emotionless. He couldn't believe her words after everything that had happened. Melissa, you've already said it all. But I've decided this can't be forgiven. I want you to understand why this happened, why you should never have done this. She was still trying to find the strength to apologize, but she couldn't find the words to make everything right again. Something in her voice broke. Andrew, I can't take this anymore. I broke you, and it hurts me, she admitted, unable to hold back her tears. You don't understand how much I regret it. But her words didn't change the situation. Andrew heard her, but they couldn't alter his thoughts. He knew she needed more than just an apology. She had to understand what real accountability meant, and she had to experience it herself. So, he stepped back and left the room, leaving her alone with her emotions. She realized it wasn't just about words. She understood that forgiveness from Andrew wouldn't come easily, and that she might have lost him forever. Day after day, Melissa tried to find a way to win Andrew back. She came to him, tried to talk, promising to change, but he was relentless. He wouldn't let her believe that everything could go back to the way it was. It was a harsh lesson for her. In the end, she understood that her betrayal would leave an indelible mark on her life. Andrew remained indifferent, and that was the most painful lesson of all. What would you do in Andrew's place? Forgive the betrayal or choose revenge? Share your thoughts in the comments.